Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this morning's session. Again, I'm Ben Shedd, Professor of Digital Filmmaking at the School of Art, Design, and Media. And I just wanted to put a little cultural note in here. For those of you who are some of our speakers and traveled in, I know in the note that was sent to you, it said, please dress casual dressy. Is that the term, casual? Smart casual, right, smart casual. And I'd like to let you know that in Singapore, smart casual means what I'm wearing, which is a sport coat with an open collar. I also have learned through my colleague Ken Feinstein, who's talking later, that the shirt position is called tucked out, which works very, very well in this humid area. Earlier this year, Lucasfilm has a new building in Singapore called the Sandcrawler, and I was asked to represent our school in the opening event. And the smart casual was the dress of the day. Mr. Lucas is an alumnus of USC School of Cinematic Arts, as am I. He was there 5 years before I was, and I've been at various events where he and others have spoken, and I've never seen the man in a necktie ever, and only often wearing Levi's. And at this particular event where the Prime Minister of Singapore was dressed smart casual without a tie and a coat, Mr. Lucas was the only person in the room with a necktie on because his wife had asked him to wear one that day. And it was really interesting to say that was smart casual from the outside of a culture coming in, whereas from the inside of a culture coming out, this is smart casual, just so you all know. As we start this next part, I'd like to introduce Scott Lucas. Scott is the person whose book I found first, and I got to meet him as a result of his book, The Immersive World's Handbook, Designing Theme Parks and Consumer Spaces. Last summer, I traveled to Beijing for the International Planetarium Society meeting called IPS, and for IAPA, which is the International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions. And Shen Lo, who will be speaking later, joined me there as he was an incoming PhD student. And together we went to the IAPA conference, and in their bookstore, there was this wonderful book. And I said, this is great for my work and perhaps for his research. And I just wanted to introduce Scott by just showing the introduction pages of a couple of sections. This one is called Designing Effective, Immersive, and Creative Spaces. And the second introduction page, this is chapter 4, Authenticity, Believability, and Realism, which is part of directly what we're speaking of today. And there, I'm going to introduce you with the three questions you have on this page. What is authenticity and how does it relate to creating effective immersive spaces? What are some of the ways to develop authenticity in a space? What role does the human factor play in designing an effective space? And I can tell you as a reader, he provides structure, rules, and ideas that really give tools to making this work in this. And with that, I introduce Scott Lucas, please.
Ben, thank you for the gracious introduction, and thanks to you last night to talk about immersion. We had an opportunity to tour the iDome, which is an amazing space I'm sure all of you have seen, but in studying something like this, certainly I don't assume that I've seen everything there is to see about immersion, and so quite amazing. And also thank you to Andrea, of course, for inviting me to the conference. And just to let you know here, if any of the handouts in here, sometimes if we go through quickly, you can go to that small URL and download the handouts there, some of these charts and so forth, if that is interesting to you. So I'll leave that for just a second to look at. And then you can also email me, of course. I begin with this juxtaposition of two spaces that appear to be dissimilar. A face of nostalgia at Disney's Cars Land, where the past is projected through desires of a simpler life, of Route 66 Americana, and the optimistic vision of an unburdened cultural identity at the National Museum of the American Indian that's shaped by technological enunciations and postmodern semiotics, suggests a past that must be at least partially escaped with the reminders of the modern world and a now different lifestyle that portends a we can't go back to how it was existentialism. By juxtaposing spaces that appear to be on different ends of a heritage continuum, we see the fault lines of heritage in such ways that they allow us to relativize and simultaneously problemize the spaces that are players in this discursive world of heritage. We might acknowledge the Janus-faced idea of heritage, which etymologically implies the passing on of something and the emptiness or lack of something in the act of passing. This is an important acknowledgement, particularly as we begin to delve into the arena of contemporary heritage, and we encounter greater and greater spatial senses of the creeping of postmodernism, relativization of past and future, uncertainty about authenticity, and the contingency of heritage in terms of its roles, the participants in its spaces, and its interpreters and critics. An image like this one from the Paris Las Vegas succinctly highlights the Janus-faced idea of heritage. Heritage, to delve further into etymology, suggests the idea of a descendant or offspring, when it perhaps should, at least today, suggest the idea of the hybrid or the cyborg. As Laura Jane Smith has expressed, typically heritage implies, quote, a universalizing normative ideal that everyone should value the same things, end quote. Brian Graham adds to this context and suggests that, quote, heritage provides meaning to human existence by conveying the ideals of timeless values and unbroken lineages that underpin identity, end quote. The universal, the timeless, the unbroken lineage of heritage again points to the concept of descent and its opposite, the lack of descent. To return to the Paris Las Vegas, I would remind of the many critical texts that have used this casino and many others as an example of a space that too extravagantly departs from descendants. In this case, we might think of the critic Ada Louise Huxtable, who, in The Unreal America, argues that themed and consumer spaces represent, quote, the replacement of reality with selective fantasy, and the ills of artificiality, illusion, inauthenticity, and hollow history. As this chart from another themed casino that you might know, the Venetian, expresses, themed spaces have been identified as spaces that rely solely on essences or stereotypes, lack authenticity, and focus too exclusively on consumeristic and hedonistic purposes, and are thus spaces that can be projected in opposition to other spaces, whether natural or cultural landmarks, sites of history, museums, or others, and can be used rhetorically and politically as arguments for assurances made about the legitimacy of heritage as concept and heritage as materiality in terms of its spaces. Archaeologist Cornelius Holtorf has written of the ways in which heritage is often valued for metaphoric, not literal content. The ability to rely on and even use heritage, whether construed as the past, the nation, for identity politics, or numerous other possibilities, is an outcome of heritage's metaphoric power. Well, Paul Ricoeur reminds us of the power that metaphor plays in redescribing reality, and also while Nelson Goodman speaks of metaphor as, quote, an affair between a predicate with a past and an object that yields while protesting, end quote, so often heritage has been deployed in such ways that it has denied these metaphoric energies, presumably so as to conceal the power that is entailed in typical uses, the senses of the natural, the historic, the culturally relevant, the authentic. I would argue that we should highlight the metaphoric energies of heritage and begin to ask a series of questions about them, the most important of which might be, do the metaphors of heritage themselves have rights? Or, more specifically, as we deploy heritage, whether as an affirmation, such as in a historic site deemed to be significant to a people and their culture, or as a rejection, as in the claim that a themed Las Vegas casino cannot and should not be considered a space of heritage, to what extent is any decision about heritage rooted in the rights of people, indigenous and contemporary, and the ability of these people to collaboratively and dialogically determine their heritage and their non-heritage? Can we truly be certain, as in this case of Venice, the threatened heritage site, and the Venetian Las Vegas, the non-heritage site, that our deployments of metaphor have had the intended consequences? And what can be said of justifications for such deployments of metaphor? One result of a meditation on heritage and non-heritage may be to fully do away with dichotomous notions of people, culture, and space. In a world in which heritage and non-heritage are redeployed as places on a range of continuous variables as opposed to discrete or dichotomous variables, It is possible to conceive of the Paris, Las Vegas, or any consumer-themed space as a part of a dialogue about people, culture, and place, in a Gadamerrian hermeneutic circle sense, the overall outcome of which may be less hegemonic, deterministic, and essentialist views of people, culture, and space. As archaeologist Ian Hodder has remarked, quote, "To claim an origin in heritage is always to exclude others." Excuse me. "It is always to determine in-groups and out-groups," end quote. Hodder points to heritage as a constructed and politically contested terrain, and I would suggest that it reflects the same tensions that inform contemporary notions of culture and cultural anthropology. The dichotomous list of flexible, bounded, form, formless, universal, particular, deterministic, agentic, among many others that describes culture, may, I believe, also be applied to heritage. As Hodder suggests, and also making this parallel, culture and heritage are, more and more, being understood as flexible and hybrid and less bounded and deterministic. One of the key differences noted in postmodern versus traditionalist models of heritage is a shift from heritage and culture as a transcendental signifier that is bounded and incapable of being deconstructed and reconstructed to a non-transcendent and constructed remake that is fluid and open to deconstruction, repurposing, and reuse. In the top diagram, we note an impermeable border preventing discourse from entering but allowing emanation, while in the bottom, a more fluid give and take of discourse, interpretation, and contestation. Of course, even with a postmodernist notion of heritage, we may be no more able to decide on the appropriate constructions, uses, analyses, and criticisms of heritage spaces. To return to some previous points, heritage, especially when considered in the context of themed and immersive spaces, illustrates notable tensions in terms of both the erasures and remaking of cultures in space, as well as in terms of foundational issues like cultural essentialism and stereotyping. This chart illustrates the dynamic, constructed, and contested nature of heritage, especially when revealed in the context of spaces that, again, seem to be non-heritage ones. We could agree that heritage is a product of culture, but we would likely debate whether themed and consumer spaces are products of heritage. Themed and consumer spaces, not unlike sanctioned heritage sites, involve processes that include the valuing and overvaluing of certain essences of people, culture, and place, and the erasure and undervaluing of other essences. As problematic as these issues are, I would argue that future work that at least attempts to interface these essences with the essences and constructions of heritage and larger cultural worlds that impinge heritage spaces and themed and consumer spaces would certainly be warranted. The past, while not only the only foundation of heritage, is certainly a most significant one. The past has both the potential to affirm and maintain, as well as to confront and change. Etymologically, as a what was is construction, the past illustrates a conservative, life-affirming side in its meaning of dwelling, and a radical and future-focused side in its is or being meaning, or the possibility of moving beyond the what was part of its construction. This chart also reflects the fact that the past, as a form of heritage, operates in many registers which, as they are realized, may result in political disputes, cultural autonomy claims, and numerous other issues. The work of Chinese dissident artist Ai Weiwei, particularly in a series of works using Han Dynasty urns, offers an interesting opportunity to reflect on the contradictory nature of the past as evidence in heritage. Dropping a Han Dynasty urn from 1995 has been criticized by some as a direct affront to the past, as has his numerous other works, in which he repurposes, repaints, in some cases even defaces them with contemporary branding logos like Coca-Cola. But these criticisms, I believe, miss conceptual and political points that Weiwei is making through his rewritings of history. As a metaphor, Weiwei's urns are effective at multiple levels of denoting the contested and contradictory past that is heritage. Through his deconstruction transformation of his urns, he points to the destruction of art, property, and ideas under the Cultural Revolution of Mao, to the displacement and death of people in events like the 2008 Beijing Olympics and the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, and most notably, he further uses the metaphoric idea of the patina, in this case itself transformed as a consumer-branded version, as a reminder of the past that is lurking behind our present. And this is where I would suggest a connection to the worlds of heritage as evidenced in space. The past as was-is, and less as the monolithic past that often defines heritage, suggests the complex and contrasting and indeed perhaps complementary meanings of dwelling, staying, and being existence, and further offers new interpretations of heritage that through their contingent and constitutive nature provide more collaborative grounds on which to consider the past. We may even begin to see a space like Disney's Main Street USA, which has typically been viewed as an extreme example of the past as nostalgia, conformity, romanticism, idealism, as a space that does suggest a wrestling with the contradictory nature of the what was. On the surface, this space indeed reflects David Lowental's definition of nostalgia as the memory with the pain removed. But at a deeper level, I believe, we may critically appreciate the efforts of Walt Disney and his many descendants to represent a past that could never be, and also to rewrite the future. The ways in which Disney envisioned spaces like Main Street USA, Epcot, indeed all Disney theme parks and the brands themselves, as utopian models on which new cultures and people could be built, suggests an optimistic and potentially transformative use of the past. Social critics have been right to point out that Disney's versions are exclusionary and conservative in their design and use, but this, I believe, is the crux of the issue at hand. Again, the battle between the dwelling staying and the being existence sides of the past. Other spaces also illustrate this tension, but in much different representational senses. The Imperial War Museum, particularly its interactive features like this one on the Blitz, uses immersion, the sights, the sounds, even the smells, to convey to the visitor the dark and disturbing past that must be maintained in the future. Less realistic and more abstract and existentialist portrayals of the past, including Daniel Liebeskin's Jewish Museum Berlin, suggest that one clear strategy of dealing with dark pasts is to not overindulge and construct everything, as is often done in consumer theme spaces, but to leave fissures, gaps, erasures, present and evident in the minds of guests who interact with such spaces. On a different end of the spectrum in terms of dark tourism, we see a recent interest in what is called slum tourism, which here, in this case of the Amoya Luxury Hotel and Spa, we are reminded perhaps that not all reflections on dark pasts may indeed be appropriate. Let me move more globally from the past itself to the terms common to heritage. Again, I look to metaphor. The metaphor is typical to the study and practice of heritage, stage, library tree, archive, mana power, monument original, and nation, illustrate notions of heritage that, while promoting important aspects of culture and identity, have resulted in contemporary implications of space that result, in some cases, in hegemonic and culturally problematic constructions. In its place, it is argued, a new set of metaphors be advocated for in order to better realize dialogic, collaborative, middle-voiced, and non-hegemonic realizations of the processes of heritage study and practice. I would suggest these 6 metaphors as some of the most powerful ones that have been brought to bear on contemporary heritage and these presumed non-heritage sites. Whether the stage that performs, the library which stores, the tree that promotes descent, the power of mana which emanates, the monument that suggests the authentic and the original, or the nation which offers the essence or the essential, we see the metaphors common to heritage have the potential, through their spatial realizations, to transform the world in some of the most powerful political, cultural, economic, and indeed existential senses. While I cannot consider all of these metaphors today, let me reflect on a few. The Americans at War exhibition, part of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, is one example of the metaphor of the nation common to heritage. During a visit to the museum many years ago, I was quite surprised to see the extent to which this metaphor was developed and indeed naturalized. Most problematic for me of the Americans at War exhibit was the equating of the nation with other metaphors and narratives like freedom. In the case of the September 11th terrorist attacks pictured here on the right, the geopolitical complexities of the world, going back to the Cold War and the Mujahideen and many other contexts, are simplified to a few key essences of images, text, and the material culture of girders from the World Trade Center. In a similar sense, the National Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas deploys the metaphor of the nation to justify the proliferation of nuclear weapons during the Cold War. Noticeably absent from the spaces of the museum are the narratives or metaphors of peace and environmentalism. Both of these uses of metaphor of the nation illustrate the powerful and indeed problematic ways in which spaces of heritage impact the guests who visit them. Another space, Bodie, the historic ghost town in California, is an example of an additional metaphor, that of mana or power. In this case, however, I believe there is a more postmodern tinge in terms of how the space relies on metaphor. The park's operators have justified a process of arrested decay, which suggests that, quote, the structures of Bodhi will be maintained, but only to the extent that they will not be allowed to fall over or otherwise deteriorate in a major way, end quote. Arrested decay suggests an acknowledgement of the power or mana present in the past, but also accounts for the fact that the past is fleeting. This postmodern sensibility may indeed point to a different set of heritage metaphors that could be appropriate for the contemporary postmodern era. In place of the stage, we have conceptual art. The library is supplanted with open source, the tree with the rhizome, mana with the remix, the monument with the souvenir, and the nation with the pirate community, referencing Hakim Bey's Taz or temporary autonomous zone. Let me suggest a few examples of these today. The best stores, which existed from the 1970s through the 1980s in the United States, illustrate a material realization of the metaphor of conceptual art. The crumbling of consumer facades, the invasion of culture on nature, and perhaps their unlikely dialogue, and the concretizing effects of consumerism are all suggested in the iconic retail designs of Best, which perhaps were too often lost in the consumer, who was maybe looking more for a deal and less of an existential puzzle in his or her visit to these stores, unfortunately. We may also note the metaphor of the remix in a space like 139 Norfolk Street in New York City, which offered a number of pop-up retail concepts for the guest. An opportunity to play a pickup game of ping pong or to experience an office party even if you don't work or live near an office are some examples of the many concepts that may be said to be remixes of other contexts, spaces, and experiences common to everyday life. The architectural firm Reversible Destiny suggests another of these metaphors, that of the transformative pirate community and the related idea of flux or fluxus. The artists, architects, poets Madeline Gins and Arakawa were motivated by the relationship of the human body to domestic space and the overarching existential concerns of life and death. The Bioscleves house pictured here suggests a reversal of the typical ways in which individuals interact with home spaces. A space of comfort is made more difficult as inhabitants are forced to negotiate typically level floors and stretch well beyond their reach for electrical outlets that are deliberately placed beyond their bodies. According to one commentator on their work, it makes people think through what they wouldn't normally think through. In terms of both the metaphors of the rhizome and the souvenir, I point to Café Sibelia in Berlin and a number of restaurants of the chain known as Juan Puello in the United States. With Café Sibelia, one finds the curious admixture of the accoutrements of Stalin-era Berlin, as one might see in a museum, and the typical trappings of a cafe that serves breakfast items, salads, and coffee. At Juan Puello's corporate headquarters in San Bernardino, California, one discovers homage to the first ever McDonald's restaurant, whose interior features thousands and thousands of McDonald's memorabilia items mixed in a postmodern sense with examples of Juan Puello's own fast food branding and logos, which have little or no relationship to McDonald's. Indeed, the McDonald's Corporation made many efforts to block Juan Puello's reappropriation of McDonald's own history. A second Juan Puello restaurant combines typical fast food menu items of roast chicken with a strange museum marking the historic route, Route 66 in the United States. Both of these spaces, I believe, illustrate how the space of heritage may come to exemplify postmodern and deconstructive potentials of the rhizome with non-hierarchical and rootless tendencies, and, as we see here, the souvenir, with its sense of offering only vague traces of a vanished and potentially non-existent original, referencing, of course, Walter Benjamin's notion of art and technological reproduction. And it is current ethnographic work with the curious Juan Puello spaces that has inspired me to think of some ways in which the metaphors of previously distinct heritage and consumer spaces might be brought into closer proximity. Ethnographic studies of both the analytical and practice sides of heritage provide important new opportunities for consideration of heritage, particularly in the areas of emic or insiders analysis and phenomenology, new approaches to theory and method, development of contemporary notions of a heritage that stress complexity, even ambiguity, and bridging opportunities for collaboration. The on-the-ground insights that may be brought to bear on all levels of heritage, including construction, use, interpretation, and criticism, fall into the realm of the ethnographic, the emic, the phenomenological, and the insiders levels of consideration. Many heritage spaces have benefited from thorough ethnographic analyses that have indeed suggested the contested and contingent nature of the past and its varied projection in the present. The consumer spaces that I typically study have not been the subject of the same levels of ethnographic consideration, and I thus have suggested the value of such research in spaces that are typically written off as hedonistic, consumerist, escapist, and robotic in nature. Such consideration promotes an additional value, which is the development of new approaches to theory and research. In a bit later, I will mention a research project of which I've been a part, which attempts to fuse theory and practice, critical and pleasure-based approaches, and other modes of theory and research, which may shed additional light on consumer and heritage spaces. Such attempts may be labeled as bridging opportunities that break down the previous tensions between academic critic, designer practitioner, and guest, who all play roles in these spaces. I believe that these many insights that derive from ethnographic or on-the-ground approaches indeed result in greater appreciation of the gray, complex, and ambiguous nature of heritage and consumerism and their various enunciations in space. Of course, such appreciation may not always be tolerated, particularly as we consider how what I might call a Nietzschean view of heritage and consumer spaces results in a lack of efficacy for designers, critic, operator, and guests alike. As a way of perhaps whittling down the existentialism just a bit, let me suggest a review of the work of Jean-François Lyotard, specifically his premise of postmodern society. This quote, while written in 1979, holds much relevance today. Lyotard has defined postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives, so in a sense, a doubt of the grand stories that we've told of religion, history, and culture. And I believe that this quote here that I've identified captures the essence of this definition. We could easily substitute reggae with EDM or dubstep music, Paris perfume in Tokyo with an iPhone in Berlin, and so on. We could even add a few spaces to this postmodern mix of the world, the Louvre, the Hard Rock Cafe, for example. The point being that the decline of the grand meta-narratives of the past, both at the ideational or existential level and the spatial material level, has resulted in a curious and confounding contemporary world. What is key in understanding how these ideational material entities have proliferated and spread around the world is discovered in Lyotard's statement that knowledge is a matter for TV games. It is easy to find a public for eclectic works. Again, we could substitute TV with the internet or mobile social media, but the result perhaps is the same. We are living in a postmodern condition in which no one ideational or material entity is supreme. Each is to be valued or devalued equally. Each is to be praised all the same, with the idea that a new entity is just around the corner, waiting to have its 15 minutes of fame in the light of the consumer world. I might say that Lyotard's postmodern condition, as it builds on the idea of the local and the relativistic of Wittgenstein's language games, promotes a remix or remake sensibility. I may also surprise you today by suggesting that such a sensibility could actually make the matter of heritage more possible, albeit heritage as redefined. Hybridity, as a thematic for the future of heritage, offers the possibility of a nascent formless, in part due to its emphasis on the postmodern modes of fusion, remixing, remaking, and intertextuality. Spaces of the future, as well as their use and interpretation, may come to be defined as less the results of the matters of descent, trees, and authenticity, and more as the products of remaking, remixing, and hybridity. The Museum of Jurassic Technology in Venice, California, is a contemporary space that illustrates the potentials of these new forms. Some of the displays within the museum feign a sense of the past with an effort to use it as a justification for the museum's own legitimacy. The visitor soon discovers that some of the exhibits within the space, including this bat that is purported to be able to teleport through solid concrete, could in fact be ruses. The point of the museum, in a reflexive sense, is to force the visitor to meditate on fact and fiction and to ultimately consider constructs like the past and all these museal efforts to represent it as forms of remaking. As a hybrid space, somewhere between a museum and a conceptual art project, the Museum of Jurassic Technology illustrates the potentials of elements like the intertextual and the remix. Yet, as I illustrate in this chart, we need to acknowledge the fact that the hubris of hybridity, especially in the example of cultural imperialism, often relegates this transformative potential of this form inconsequential. A second space, Dennis Seaver's house in London, further illustrates the power of intertextuality as a component of heritage space. Ian Hodder once said that, quote, "The appropriate question about heritage is not about descent, but about the extent to which people participate in heritage, or rather, how much they have the capability to participate in it," end quote. Like the Museum of Jurassic Technology, this venue is very difficult to categorize. Visitors walk through the many floors of a Georgian house and vicariously experience the lives of a family of Huguenot silk weavers. Some have called this space an example of still life drama, if there is such a thing. Historical periods intertextually merge in the many exhibits which are interspersed with poetic narratives and that sometimes admonish the visitor to not apply his or her preconceptions to the space and to simply try and take it all in. Sievers once said that the goal of the space was to, quote, "create what turned out to be a collection of atmospheres, moods that harbor the light and the spirit of various ages." With Seaver's words, I would add that contemporary notions of heritage, not unlike some forms of contemporary theming, may place more emphasis on the realm of the ideational, including affect, values, dialogues, and relationships, and less on the material qualities of heritage. An irony given heritage traditional construction as being rooted in materiality. A third important venue in my consideration of the future of heritage is Jorvik. Jorvik and the associated Archaeological Research Centre, or ARC, in York, England, represents a curious hybrid approach to heritage. At some levels, it appears as a museum or interpretive center with displays that have a pedagogical focus. But at other levels, it references the worlds of theme parks, with gift shops, forms of reenactment, and a theme park ride that uses the context of Viking history and archaeological efforts in the present as a means of fusing entertainment and education. As controversial as Jorvik likely is for the traditionalists, it is a space that could at least begin a dialogue about some of the assumptions that are made and the conceptual spaces that still exist between heritage and non-heritage. We may begin to imagine ways in which we can break down some of these dichotomies of the past. Dennis Seaver's house, the Museum of Jurassic Technology, and Jorvik all emphasize a conceptual, postmodern, and deconstructivist approach to the past and forms of heritage representation, and they all suggest some key points reflected in my next statement. New developments that may be called postmodern approaches to heritage analysis and practice have as their center the sensibilities common to experimental and avant-garde aesthetics, new criticism, including feminism and postmodern ethnography and social science, and contemporary literary and cultural criticism, such as deconstruction, intertextuality, and other forms of the dialogic text. Such sensibilities offer the possibility of new forms of analysis, criticism, and practice design of heritage spaces. As I suggested earlier in the example of the architectural firm Reversible Destiny, it is possible to imagine ways to materialize new and postmodern metaphors, notions, narratives, and contexts in space. Re-examining Reversible Destiny, we might conclude that the project is nothing more than a curious, if not eccentric, experiment in space that though does draw on experimental and existential qualities, does not result in a large-scale cultural transformation of people or culture in general. But this view, I believe, loses sight of the fact that the limited experiments of Reversible Destiny suggest new imaginings of space, culture, and those who inhabit them. In other projects that I have begun in Germany and England, I've suggested the inspirations of projects like Reversible Destiny could result in larger-scale transformations. The project in England considers some ways in which contemporary museum and even theme park spaces may emphasize dark or controversial political topics. The project in Germany though also following the consideration of controversial topics in themed and immersive spaces, has expanded quite significantly to focus on what I consider to be an additional realm of significance in terms of the future of heritage, and this is the arena of research. The project that began in Germany involves a series of experiments that attempts to create forms of collaboration between players on opposite sides of the aisles in terms of the design and study of themed and immersive spaces. These efforts have included the cross-fertilization of discursive experiments in which critics or academics attempt to write in the various modes or the vernacular of industry insiders and the reverse. Our group has included academics, designers, and former theme park workers, and our first collaboration, pictured here, actually it's back here, first collaboration. This first collaboration involved the study of time and temporality in Disney's theme parks in California, and then later we all collaborated on a panel at the American Studies Association conference, and then following that, we created a series of post-site visit reports. And I should indicate here that the players in this group so far, and it is growing, so perhaps we can continue to grow it, is Gordon Grice, pictured at the left side there, who is a designer for Forak, based out of Toronto. Next to him is Dr. Florian Freitag of the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany. And next to him is Dr. Filippo Carla, who formerly at Mainz now teaches ancient history at the University of Exeter. So again, this was the part of the post-site research report that we created. And as I mentioned, these sometimes reflect overlapping and sometimes competing interests in terms of the players related to these spaces. Future efforts may place more attention on the collaboration between such groups and will also address the need for more on-site or in-situ research of themed and immersive spaces. And this leads to a final statement on heritage today. The future of heritage study and practice may include important attention to the issues of contestation, notably the manner in which conversations about heritage may occur, especially considering the intense political and contradictory frames of such debates, complicity, or realizations about the constitutive and political nature of heritage considerations, and collaboration, my last point there, specifically the idea of creating dialogue and middle-voiced approaches among various people, practitioners, spaces, interpretations, and design practices. Again, the experiments that I've begun suggest open and honest dialogue between players in the same field, who though do share a common arena of practice or work, have been unable to speak the same language in terms of that arena. In the case of heritage studies, I can only imagine how powerful similar conversations between the academic critics of heritage spaces and designers, users, and operators of those spaces might indeed become. Contemporary ethnographic work has stressed these elements of contestation, collaboration, complicity, as ways of imagining cross-fertilization and hybridity among the fields and the actors of those fields in many domains of the contemporary world. As a key metaphor, I would point to the middle voice. The middle voice, which not present in English, is that which stands between the active and the passive voices. Beyond its linguistic relevance, it is a powerful metaphor for thinking about these new arenas or contexts of research and collaboration in terms of heritage. The middle voice promotes what could be called a constitutive approach in which a given actor in the field of heritage, whether academic, designer, or patron, considers her or himself a part of a vast field or array that is composed of endless multiplicities of material orders, design spaces, interpretive considerations, memes and information, conversations and dialogues, all of which suggest a polyvocality and intertextuality. And maybe to express the metaphor a little more, if I said today in the active voice, I'm picking up the chair, again, I can't really do it in English, I could approximate it and say the chair and I are involved right now in the act of being picked up, right? So it makes quite a difference because in a lot of linguistic systems that have a SVO, subject, verb, object order, rhetoricians have pointed to the point that what is key is that the actor, the agent, I'm dominating something else through this objective status. So in a middle voice, the chair and I would both be involved in this kind of co-evolving moment in reality. And again, it's existential, and also I think it, references certainly the world of avant-garde art in terms of participatory aesthetics and so forth. So connected to these polyvocal and dialogic conversations that may be had of spaces of the future is the significance of the remake. In much of my work, I've been concerned with the numerous dimensions that are implied in a cultural remake. Beginning with this Latin prefix re, we see that remaking connotes notions of moving back or towards the starting point, back from a point reached, sending or looking back, and the idea of returning and away. Combined with the backness of re is the sense of again, or an action that is performed a second or further time as it is repeated. The remake is an apt location on which to consider the intertwined issues of heritage and culture, as well as their deployments in space. The remake allows us to consider issues of form and aesthetics, economic issues and questions about power and hegemony, history, memory, psychology, and numerous other topics. What is most important in my mind about the remake is its Janus-faced and duplicitous nature. Simultaneously, a remake may involve newness and forgetting, and conservation and nostalgia. By its very nature, a remake is a product of old and new, a conservative and liberal form, a thing that shows traces of two or more forms, but does not inherently resemble any one of those forms. Theoretical and ethnographic considerations of remaking may yield important new models that are applicable to the study of heritage sites. Archaeologist Cornelius Holtorf's notion of pastness, or our subjective perception of how the past is perceived by us, and this is often achieved through material culture cues. This notion of pastness of Holtorf is one example of an attempt to struggle with the dynamics of remaking, especially as some forms of the past now defy time and chronology in favor of appearance, affect, and perception. Similarly, we might consider how previous concepts that hold relevance in terms of heritage sites, like authenticity, are indeed in need of revision. Post-authenticity, as such a revision, might imply, like pastness does for the past, that authenticity may no longer exist as an objective quality, but more as a subjective one that deals with the perception of authenticity, its meta-nature, as a thing that matters in heritage but can never be called absolute or transcendent. These and other concepts could be particularly significant in addressing the future of heritage, and there are other inspirations to speak of as well. The post-processualist school in archaeology, particularly for its concern with the meta-narratives that have defined archaeology, the writing culture and feminist schools in contemporary anthropology, notably for the emphases on the power dynamics of fieldwork, ethnographic representation, and the rhetoric of ethnographic texts, and the cultural criminology school connected to the University of Kent, especially for its advocacy of a constitutive approach to crime and society, are all examples of inspirations from outside of the world of heritage that may be brought into dialogue with heritage studies. The future of heritage may also include emphasis on new approaches to space itself. In other work, I have written of the importance of incorporating political and controversial meanings and contexts within contemporary spaces, whether museums or theme parks. The effect of such revamping a space is to ultimately require the designers, operators, visitors of these spaces to reflect on their own complicity as it might relate to the context of the space or even their very being in or using that space. Likewise, we can imagine ways of making space more open. As Umberto Eco spoke of in his text, The Open Work, we can imagine situations in which spaces, much like text, can be made more readerly and less writerly. Spaces, especially through new technology and mobile media, illustrated here with the new Quantum of the Seas cruise ship, can be made more flexible, less permanent, and ultimately more applicable to the whims, the desires of the visitors of those spaces. In my work on immersive spaces, I have written of the desirability of givebacks and takeaways, or efforts to allow guests to inscribe their own identities onto the space and to take some of the space's identity with them when they leave. And I would suggest that such efforts amount to an effort to rewrite the space as a life space. A life space is the sense of the space when it expands beyond the limited physical confines of the venue. Like Henry Jenkins' work on convergence culture, in which users and fans of media forums and popular culture play a very active role in co-creating that culture, the ideals of the life space suggest that spaces of heritage and theme spaces may become spaces that are co-evolved, including by patrons, and that they never, in a sense, achieve completion or finality. And, as I alluded to earlier with reversible destiny, we could see many opportunities to develop heritage in other spaces in such ways that they challenge the traditional expectations of what space and its deployments of heritage should be. The inspirations of post-structuralist approaches in arts and literary criticism could be brought into alignment with spaces of the future. I'm speaking here of a number of futures for both heritage and spaces that are likely rarely defined as forms of heritage, themed and immersive spaces. As a cultural anthropologist who has worked in the theme park industry and has studied themed and immersive spaces, I value the challenge that is inherent in the study of heritage and appreciate the ambiguities and contradictions that are present in the spaces that I have studied. Some time after I published 2 academic studies of theme parks and theme spaces, I was approached to write a text that focused on the nature of themed and immersive spaces from a practical or hands-on perspective. This project became the Immersive Worlds Handbook, and I soon discovered additional and increased ambiguities, contradictions, and subjectivities that I have found are located at the intersections of the work, views, perspectives, and politics of designers, operators, guests, academic analysts of themed and immersive spaces. I interviewed a number of experts who represent many of these backgrounds, and I wish to close today on one such interview with Gordon Jones, who is senior military historian and curator at the Atlanta History Museum, and whom I featured for a chapter on authenticity. Gordon is quite unique in that he bridges the academic and practice worlds of theming. His particular focus is Civil War reenactment, an arena of lived heritage or lived theming that has generated controversy for some of the ways in which the past is brought back to life. During the course of the interview for Immersive Worlds, I asked Gordon to reflect on what I believe is becoming an emergent arena of themed and immersive spaces. This is the way in which theming, its narrative, stories, details, is brought inward, inside the individual, who, in this case, is reenacting the battles and other experiences of the Civil War. As I began to create a typology of the different camps of reenactors, it occurred to me that the most hardcore of such individuals are striving for a state of theming and immersion that is almost entirely subjective and part of the realm of the emic and the phenomenological of which I spoke earlier. I pressed Gordon for more about the subjective realm of the past, its performative and affective dimensions, at which point he offered a very succinct discussion of how this realm of the past is achieved in an authentic sense. And I quote here, "To be effective at stimulating a rush, historically themed environments need not be true in any historical sense. They need only be real, in quotes, in the eyes or in the eye of most beholders. As seen in reenacting, though, what is real is always contested, since each of us imagines and approaches the past slightly differently." Gordon's statement on authenticity and reality does not, by any means, resolve many of the controversies related to heritage, authenticity, and the past that I have mentioned today. It does, however, suggest to us that the future of heritage and its various expressions in space, whether deemed proper museums, theme parks, or even lifestyle venues, will likely be found in the quotidian realms of experience, affect, subjectivity, and the personal. Thank you.